Gayle and Bill Hartman, and present are Helen Ingram and Gwynn Benner. And I think we should begin with our usual question, which is how you two got involved in the Sonoran Desert and the Upper Gulf, and sort of what that area means to you.
You should start with that one. You can do the Pentecost.
We live here.
Yeah. Well, that's true.
I kept thinking that's part of the answer. I mean, I think people, I don't think of the Sonoran Desert as an intellectual construct that's somehow outside. You know, it's kind of where we live, and I think we're both people that are kind of interested in our surroundings and natural history and so on. So I just see it partly as a natural outgrowth of living in this area, and I often imagine, you know, if I had lived in some other area, I'd be interested in that. I grew up near Pittsburgh, and my father had put together a slideshow on the French and Indian War in that area, and some of the sites that most people didn't really, you know much about that history in the 1700s, and so that kind of thing is my approach to it. And I have to say that I'm not nearly as professionally involved in Sonoran Desert issues as Gayle is.
I thought you were going to talk about the Pentecost.
Well, yeah, we'll come to that, and that's, I mean, I as a graduate student, I came here in '61, and so I was a student in Gerard Kuiper's lab, the Kuiper Belt fame, and '61 was when President Kennedy announced that we were going to try to go to the moon. Yuri Gagarin had just made a flight around the world, and the first space flight around the world. So we were all interested in. I mean, it became obvious that in that decade the nation was going to attempt to go to the moon, and there was a tremendous effort in that direction. And so my graduate student circle of pals and I discovered a geological reprint from a conference that had been run by the geology department here the year before, which gave a kind of a road log into the Pentecost. And we jumped into my little Ford Mustang, which was an insane thing to do. And I mean, it was the Ford Falcon was actually the first one.
Right.
And went driving down there and drove around the Pentecost, because we all came from parts of the country where we had never seen lava flows and craters and so forth. So that was a kind of a pure planetary science interest, but I immediately got fascinated by that area, particularly that area. Came back, started delving into the stacks in the library and discovering all these wonderful old books, Hornaday and Lumholtz, those classic writers who wrote a certain style of, what we might think of as environmental literature today, but it was much more kind of exploration. Here's this wonderful place that Europeans haven't been to yet. That style of book, which were all forgotten. You go in there and the last time the book was checked out was 5 years ago in 1956, and so I felt like I was discovering all this literature that nobody knew, and out of that then grew my book Desert Heart, which drew on a lot of that literature.
What about you, Gayle?
Well, I've mostly lived in deserts much of my life, although not this one. But I seem to have an affinity just for deserts.
Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up a lot of different places because my father was in the military, but I went to some of my high school years I was slightly embarrassed to admit this, but the little town of El Centro across the border in California.
Center of the universe.
Center of the universe, that's right. And real people actually live in El Centro. Because it's a sort of irrigated farming community, you don't actually have so much of a sense that you're in the desert there. But my father, bless his heart, used to like to get in our old Chevy and drive out to, Glamis, the little mining town, and various places that other people didn't go. And I found this to be quite interesting. I also, as a high school student, developed an interest in anthropology and more archaeology, I suppose, and went on a couple of little excavations in that part of the world. I remember the first time I dug up a potsherd or something, I was just so excited. I went to the Peace Corps in Peru after I graduated from college, and I think that, although it was somewhat desert, but more to the point, it was Spanish. So when I came here, the combination of deserts and Spanish were both very intriguing to me. And one of the first places when we had just been married a year or so, that I really wanted to go was Tinajas Altas, this high tanks as it's called in English, these water tanks near the border, because I had heard a lot about them as a younger person, and I just was intrigued by this place. And so we actually had a friend who lived in Welton, and we got his old, what they call those old things, they don't have them anymore, but sand buggies or something, before the modern kinds of vehicles, and went, dune buggies, I guess they were called, and went down there, and had a wonderful time. It was very, very interesting and very fun. And actually, a little tiny story about that trip, which we didn't recognize at the time. Bill took a photograph out in front of Tinajas Altas of a standing wooden cross, a little stone and a bunch of stones. And we much later discovered that that was probably the remains of the last cross in that little cemetery that had been out in front of Tinajas Altas since the 49er period, over a century before. And it's all completely gone now. So that picture has been photographed many times now as the last cross on Tinajas Altas. But that's really my interest. And then I started going to the Pinacates with Bill and was just fascinated by it, almost more from a, kind of aesthetic point of view than anything else.
Yeah.
Certainly archaeological, but I never really did any archaeology there. I would certainly see things on the ground, and I began to read about the area. And it was just a combination, as I said, of the desert, which I liked, and the fact that, and other people have said this, that from an archaeological point of view, everything is visible. It's out there on the ground. And also, I think it was T.E. Lawrence or somebody that said, the desert is clean. Yeah. And that has always struck me, too. It's both clean and interesting. Pine forests, to me, are kind of boring. I'm sure there's lots of interesting biology in pine forests, but they never intrigued me very much. But the desert, everything is kind of there and visible, and there's a kind of a beautiful order to it that I've always just been intrigued by.
All right.
Lawrence talked about that a lot. Yeah, Lawrence of Arabia. This is it basically just what Gayle was saying. That kind of sense of being in this alien, but clean. He kept using the word place.
Vast.
Yeah.
That too. Yeah. And, you can see the horizon. I have had the experience when I go back east that for 2 or 3 days, New York or somewhere, or North Carolina is interesting, and I very quickly get claustrophobic. I can't see the horizon, and that
really, Westerners
really bothers me. So,
I think that one more comment about the Pinacates, the craters and the lava flows and so forth.
Yeah.
That the broader Sonoran Desert itself is a little bit of an intellectual construct, and also, there's miles of areas that you're driving through, and not a whole lot is changing at a detailed level. It is, but immediately going into the Pinacate area, I think there's some visceral. There's just, even if you think you're not interested in the desert, or you're not interested in what these environmentalists are talking about, or this, like was calling an intellectual construct, but there's just something immediately visceral about that, and being in a big circular crater or standing on the rim of it, where nature is creating these big circular symmetric forms, that is, to me, just very intriguing.
I have one other comment, a little bit related. I also have always very much liked water, and the Gulf of California I've always enjoyed it. As a child, when we lived in El Centro, we went to Ensenada and places like that. And when I came over here as a graduate student in 1966, the next year I had met some friends who were more in zoology and biology than I was, and we took what now it seems like a foolhardy trip, but we survived in a couple of sedans. Basically, we drove down to Caborca and Pitiquito, and then out across the desert to Puerto Libertad, and then more or less down the coast to Quino Bay, going in and around the estuaries and getting stuck in the sand, many times. And there, at the time, there was just nothing there. We stopped at Quino Bay. The Seri were, well, I'm not sure what word to use, but we traded old Air Force uniforms to them for some carvings and things that I still have. And of course, that was both a combination of sort of anthropology and an interesting location, a strange location, and a place that I still am very intrigued by, even though it has changed so dramatically. I can hardly believe. Yeah.
Well, maybe it's a good thing now to talk about how you've gotten involved in more activist work, and also maybe a little bit about the relationship of books to policy and environmental change and how you feel about that. That might be, the various forms of expression.
Well, I'm more, as Bill says, the political activist than Bill is, and Bill is more of an academic and a very good writer. I'm not exactly sure what explains my interest in political action. It's just one of those things you're born with, I suppose. But in this location, as you have perceptively pointed out, there's a lot of interesting possibilities here, and I became intrigued by those not long after I moved here, although initially my involvement in political action was more at the Tucson level, planning and zoning and trying to do things in the Tucson mountains and that sort of thing. I became local chair of the Sierra Club, and the kind of obvious routes that people take. But I think that ISDA was one of the amazingly successful, and I was, I have to admit, somewhat skeptical at the time that it would work, but Wendy persevered. And I don't think I've ever seen an example of that sort of community activism in the U.S. that, at least that I know of, that's been successful. That's kind of what the Peace Corps tries to do, which is what I was inculcated with, is you go into a community, but you don't tell the community what to do. You try to figure out what they think they need, and then you try to help them figure out how to do it. And that has certainly been very successful with ISDA, and I've been involved more, as I said here, in environmental action, the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan, that sort of thing, and only somewhat peripherally involved in the work in Sonoita and Ajo and Mexico, partly because there it is extremely hard to do. I've had a lot of interest in working in those areas. I did a little bit of kind of volunteer assistance with the Boyers at Sado a few times, but it's just not easy to figure out how you're going to have any kind of reasonable impact across the border.
I think that I think of books themselves as activist activities, writing books, but on a longer time scale. And I mean, I think that when you talk to various people, the kinds of people you're talking to, they actually work on different time scales. Gayle works, kind of here and now with trying to change things or build something new or create something. And I guess when I'm working on a book, I'm thinking of it as more, it's not going to have an immediate impact, but if it circulates, subliminally in the culture, it may have more of an impact. And a really nice example of that was the Desert Heart book that I did, which I think was 89.
Well, David had the bookstore, I remember.
Yeah. And the thing that was so intriguing about that is that in the following decade or so, as on the Mexican side, there began to be more rangers and more, really a kind of a wonderful emergence of an educated middle class that were going through college in Hermosillo and so forth and coming out. And we got copies of that into the hands of a number of the early rangers where we'd stop on the way down to the Pinacotes. And what I'm told, and I don't have much documentation of this, but what I'm told is that some of those copies worked their way down into Mexico City and were actually circulating as ammunition for the Biosphere Reserve being created through the UN. And I'd love to believe that story's true. I mean, I think there's some truth to it that, that people who were in positions of power to make that happen, probably had contact with that book, because there just wasn't much of any other book about that Northwest Sonora area, which is what I was trying to write about, and the cross-border region.
And one of the things about Desert Hearts was that there were so many visuals in there.
Yeah.
As opposed to Lumholtz and some of the others, which were black and white photos.
Yeah, it was.
Which was a lot of text, so it's very visually appealing.
It was a new time because those color printed books could begin to be produced commercially reasonably, and probably pioneer of that was David Brower and the Sierra Club with their books. And there's an interesting tie in there because David Brower, Gayle's folks lived in San Francisco, and we were always going back there. So I go waltzing into what was Friends of the Earth at that time, because Brower, partly because of the publication program, was using up money of the Sierra Club, ran into flack from the Sierra Club and pulled out and formed the Friends of the Earth. So I walked in with my manuscript and showed him my slides, and he wrote out a check for, as I remember, it's like $500 something for an option on that book. And we really thought it was going to become one of his books, but the trouble was by that time he was having trouble getting those books off the ground at the Friends of the Earth. But for 5 or 10 years, it looked like that was going to become in the 70s and 80s. I thought, oh, this is going to become one of Brower's books. But those kinds of books, as you say, in the earlier generation, it was the same with textbooks. You know, I wrote some college textbooks in astronomy, and my textbooks in the 60s were all black and white text and an occasional little black and white picture. And so the one that we did in the mid 70s was kind of the first emergence of big color, beautiful color inserts, you know, and that style of textbook spread very rapidly after that. But again, I thought of that textbook as a form of activism because it was very interesting. I don't know, I'm patting myself on the back too much, but there were kinds of subjects that I put in that book that weren't conventional in astronomy books. And to me, I began to see that take on things sort of emerge in popular culture. And I always wondered if some of those movie directors and so on had copies of that book, you know, as going through college as students.
One of the things that we've heard quite a bit of, and Joe Joaquin spoke about this with all of them, and they don't differentiate between art and environment.
Mm-hmm.
And that book brought both the science and the art in focus together.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've also heard about this area is it's incredibly special, and to see it and to know it, it's just an extraordinary experience. And I think, again, that book laid a framework for bringing both of those in focus together. Were you guys at the original Pinacate Symposium in '88?
The one in Hermosillo?
Yeah.
No, we weren't. One of us, I think I got sick, had a tooth abscess or something, because we were planning to go.
Your book was in process at that point.
Yeah, I remember Carlos kind of organized that review, and we didn't go.
We went to one in Hermosillo.
We went to several, but they're a little bit later.
I think later, that's right. Yeah.
And they were more ISDA-related things.
And all of those pictures were mine, so that a lot of our early trips, I mean, Gayle can tell you, I mean, they were really designed around going down there and getting some more pictures to have in the library, or photographing something that we hadn't had on the list. And of course, some of those don't make it into the book, but you know, it was nice to expand the reservoir.
I think this might be a good time, well, I don't want to interrupt you, but this might be a good time to sort of, since you've been involved in this in such a long time, to get a sense of how optimistic or pessimistic you are about your accomplishments over this period of time, and maybe a little reflection on the future. You know, something has to keep one persistent and going in this case. And what is it for you guys? And what are your ideas about the highs and maybe also the lows of the trajectory of the region? And maybe the region, since you're right, it is a bit of a construct, you're welcome to break it down to the Pinacate, the Upper Gulf.
Let me start and divide it into two parts. And I am by nature a bit of a pessimist, unfortunately. I wish I weren't, but in the Tucson area, the more local area, in some ways, I think there's been a lot of positive action. I mean, Pima County is nationally known for the creation of the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan, for very innovative work. You know, we've had 3 or 4 big open space bond issues here that have bought up large amounts of land to keep them out of development, because in this state, unlike several other states, Oregon, Vermont, others, we have no legislative ability anymore to really keep land out of development or to minimize the development. It's been extremely hard. The state legislature has made it more and more difficult all the time. But the county has bought up a lot of land, and although you don't see it, unfortunately, because it's such a big county, I know the county's as big as 2 or 3 of the little eastern states. Things would be a lot worse here, is about all I can say, if the county had not been so active. The city, unfortunately, has not been as forward-looking, partly because they just haven't had the money and partly for political reasons that I've never quite understood. So in some senses, there's a lot of positive activity that have gone along here, and Carolyn Campbell deserves a lot of credit for it. But at the same time, it's kind of obscured by the huge amount of growth. The new community, to me, are still new communities: Oro Valley, Marano, the places that didn't used to exist, and moving out into Vail and so forth. And I, right now, am spending way too much time trying to prevent a new copper mine from going in the Santa Rita Mountains. That's driving me crazy. I think we will prevail ultimately, but it's an enormous amount of energy, work on a lot of people's parts that I think we shouldn't have to be spending our time on, but that's the way it is. So in the future of this particular area, I am not horribly optimistic. We are running out of water. I don't think we have the political will or laws to really prevent or to stabilize things here before it just kind of gets worse. I mean, it'll never turn into Los Angeles. I think we will run out of water before then, and there'll have to be some changes in how we use the water. But I'm not terribly optimistic in terms of a 50 or 100-year time scale for this part of the Sonoran Desert. The mountains will still be here, and there will be some nice features, but the urban sprawl and I think even the mentality will change. As you know, Tucson is a very transient community, and the phrase I've heard is that about 50% of the people have lived here less than 10 years. Mm-hmm. So you don't have enough institutional memory. You have it in some parts of the community, but not in other parts. But to look at the western deserts, the good thing there is that there is a lot of protected land. I wish sometimes we could be more like England and have people live in, quote, protected areas. They weren't able to create national parks because they didn't have any spaces, so they simply put the towns in the national parks. And I think it's worked really quite well.
Put the national parks around
the towns. Yeah, that's a better way to say it. And I suppose in a way, Ajo's a little bit like that. But we have not come up with it. We've not been able to deal. Maybe we will in the future. But we have our big empty spots, and then we have people around them.
There's a little bit of that concept in the Biosphere Reserve, which has the inner right. kind of wilderness core zone
on the Mexican side.
Recognized an outer donut zone that included the communities like Rocky Point.
And I think on the American side, the big pieces of land are there. There were the new Sonoran Desert National Park created, not as big as Bill Broyles I would have liked, but better than nothing, I guess. And I have to say that the somewhat new managers of the Goldwater Range on the Marine and Air Force side have been a huge improvement. When we started working there in the mid-'80s, I was working out for the U of A at that time on the very first Natural and Cultural Resources Management Plan for the Goldwater. And it was lots of fun. We had a great time. But the management was kind of vague, was between non-existent and terrible. And both Broyles and I had these photographs of saguaros being knocked over just because some guy in a Jeep thought it would be a fun thing to do, apparently. And lots of, when we first got really riled up, it was because the Marines had started doing ground exercises out there for the first time. Instead of just flying over it and dropping things, they had been going out there in big vehicles and really making a mess. And I must say, in a way, the American system kind of worked. We screamed and hollered, literally, jumped up and down, went to meetings, grabbed these colonels by the scruff of the neck, took them out there. I remember this one very funny occasion. We took them to an archaeological site, and I was talking about these rock circles and so forth. He said, "Oh, I don't see it." And I said, "Well, you're standing in the middle of one." And he said, "Oh!" And you could just see this epiphany go off in his mind. And after that, he became a convert, and there was no more Marine activity in that area. And both the Marines and the Air Force have become really, really quite good as a result. So that's kind of the positive thing. The border problems, of course, are extraordinarily negative and new. I remember, what's his name, Roger, the guy who was the lax director of Cabeza. He had been the assistant director, and he'd gone away, and he'd come back. Roger, Bill Broads would know his name. Anyway, we were having some meeting, this was like 6 or 8 years ago, and we were talking about the usual things, pronghorn and water holes and so forth, and he said, kind of disgustedly, he said, we're just talking about, what was the phrase, moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic or something like that, and while the ship is sinking. And he was referring, of course, to the real issue, which hadn't even been in existence a few years before, and we had paid no attention to it, and it sort of was outclassing, everything else. And I don't, I'm not going to get into solutions to that because I don't know what they are really, but it certainly has made a huge difference from an environmental and a social point of view. The O'odham are affected, and there's just all kinds of problems associated with it.
We actually drove down to Lukefield just because we had been told that the border fence and the wall was pretty extensive right there. Have you been out? Have you seen any of the changes there?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's shocking. At Tinaja Saltis, you used to be able to, you just drove down and there was a little, maybe 2-wire barbed wire fence or something, and the gate, but there was nothing in the gate, it was just a hole in the little fence. And I've walked through that many times, hiking and just for all kinds of reasons, and in the 70s, 80s, nobody paid any attention to you. Then one time, must have been in the late 90s, a few of us were out, I was working at Tinaja Saltis, but on a day off we decided we were going to try to walk up a little valley, and to access the valley we had to walk across the border and come back. And we didn't get very far before we heard whoop, 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 whoop. And the colonel came by, Colonel Child, I think his name was, and it was a Sunday morning, and he was not happy to be gotten out of bed and come out there. And he comes marching across to us and saw these 3 or 4 gringos, and we explained, and we used the magic term, we were friends of Bill Broyles, and that settled him down.
Bill Broyles Pass.
Yeah, it's by Bill Broyles Pass, yeah. And so we had a little chat, and he went away. But now you couldn't, of course you can't even, there's a big wall there.
What kind of wall is it?
It's a big metal cement.
So it's not the ballards?
No, it's not the vehicle. The vehicle fence, which I think is reasonably acceptable to me and has been fairly effective in many ways, is an organ pipe, and I guess on some of the reservation land, O'odham land. But the Goldwater has been the wall, and of course what it's doing is simply funneling people into other areas. I do have to tell you a funny story that I just learned recently at a meeting with the new Cabeza Prieta manager, very nice young man, who is a biologist, and said what he really likes to do is be out of doors, working with nature. But a couple of years ago, before the wall went up, before the vehicle barrier went up, he was out camping one night in the Cabeza, and he said it was just amazing what would happen. It was night, it was dark, and all of a sudden lights would come on all over the place, and these were all the Mexican vehicles, laden with people and drugs, I suppose, that had been parked under mesquite trees and hiding because they knew when the Border Patrol shift change was. And soon as that shift change, they all take off and they go north and try to make it up to I-8. And then before the next shift comes in, exactly. And then the vehicle barrier came in, so that didn't happen anymore, but now it's simply people. And the Border Patrol themselves have made, I don't know if you've seen the map, it's just an astonishing aerial map of the extent of roads on the wildlife refuge. Whole valleys that are just kind of, they're not roads in quite the sense of, a road here, but vehicle tracks, just the whole valleys are just covered with them.
And they weren't subject to the restrictions on that, right? On creating the
Border Patrol, well, the answer is no, they aren't. Some of them do better than others, but this has been a very difficult ongoing problem as to how to deal with the Border Patrol themselves. So I've talked too much, so it's your turn.
No, just sort of the prognosis and sort of where you think things are going.
Did you have a prognosis comment?
Well, let me make one more comment on the Mexican side. This is kind of obvious, and you should show that picture, Bill, but we've been visiting the other side of the border since the 60s, or at least I have, and actually before that, the 50s, when I used to live in El Centro. And for years, we would go down and camp at what was called Sandy Beach, north, well, I would say north, it's not north, I guess it's west of what's Rocky Point. And there was nothing there, of course. It was just a long beach between Rocky Point and Pelican Point, I guess it's called out by Choya Bay. Yes.
I often wave this around. I don't know if that can be seen, but we can show a digital. So I wave this around as a quiz. People come by and they say, "What city in the world is this?"
Miami?
Is this
And
Miami?
it looks like Miami. It looks like Cannes to me, or something like that. On the French Riviera, and that is Rocky Point. And that actually is this beach that Gayle talked about. That people would go down and put their tents on that beach.
And of course, the interesting.
Amazing.
I mean, this to me is a real,
shaking her head
real
camera.
failure of Mexican government. This was apparently owned by the gentleman Gus, whatever his name was, the guy who was kind of half American, half Mexican, who owned Choya Bay, and or his descendants. I'm not sure now. And somehow or another, after all kinds of legal questions got resolved, the economic climate was right. They started building there. And I know, in my mind, maybe 2 or 3 of these condos would have been okay, but there was no limit on how much they could build. And the water and sewage problems, although they aren't dumping the sewage into the Gulf, apparently. They're sending it back somewhere, so we've been told. And the water, they say, is coming from the Sonoran aquifer, and they seem to think there's enough of that. But these things, of course, economically, they've collapsed. They started off, and everybody bought, and there was lots and lots of changes, and new people made money. But now they're standing largely empty.
And that is maybe part of economic cycle.
It may come back, but I think it's an overbuilt for that area. I just can't quite see how it can be sustainable.
I think that actually leads into my take on. I guess this is long-term thinking. That I think people need to become aware. Our whole country needs to become much more aware of the fact that these problems that we're talking about cannot be dealt with as individual problems. Let's form a committee. Let's go talk to people, because of the framework, the larger framework that we've built. So the civilization framework, at the grandest scale, and particularly in North America, in this country, that framework is at odds with, any kind of preservation efforts, because it's all geared on producing things, using resources, producing things to make money. That's sort of the main economic framework. I'm constantly amazed that during this last crash of the banking system, you read articles, and the economists, the professional economists, all seem to be stuck in 1950s Chamber of Commerce models of the world. So as a result of that, there are totally different cultures, and the trouble is we discuss these questions within the culture that we have, and most of the people you're talking to are kind of the
sustainability,
the desert sustainability, environmental awareness culture, but the actions and the outcomes and the long-term prognosis isn't governed by those people. It's governed by this external framework that we mostly ignore. And I have a lot of examples of that. One is just that all these meetings that Gayle talks about, and and I've been in on some of them, you go to the meeting and there's all these people in our sandals showing up, and then there's, from the external culture coming out of the framework, are all these people in suits who are getting paid $400 an hour to sit in the same room and discuss this, and the rest of us are sitting there being paid nothing.
Yeah. Story of my life.
Yeah. Another example is that, I go to lots of meetings, groups that Gayle's involved with. They're having, evening teas over at the old Y building, fundraisers and so forth. And I keep asking people, or for instance, democratic politics in town, and I keep asking people at those kinds of gatherings, well, have you listened to Rush Limbaugh lately? No. None of them have, because I can't stand to listen to this guy. So these whole communities are not even aware or tuned into what's being said, 8 hours a day on AM talk radio, 7 days a week, to all the people who listen to that stuff. And so I think
which is amazing to me in itself as to how that got started.
Yeah, but that's part of the problem. Yeah, it's all and now and then of course the emergence of I would list Fox Network and a whole bunch of other commentators, and that's my take. But I'm sort of stunned that we have a country now where I think journalism has basically collapsed. There was a period in the 80s or 90s when the network news centers had been financially independent centers in each network, and they were moved under the umbrella of the entertainment, managers of the network. And that was the beginning of the whole trend where the anchors become personalities, and on Fox it's all totally opinion. It's not. I mean, it's not the BBC reader reading the facts of the news. That's the other extreme. So we have a country where each faction, are you a liberal Democrat, or are you religious, or you want fundamentalist religious take on the news, you want a conservative take on the news. You pick your take on the news, and then you get your set of facts. So we have factions in the country that are in disagreement over what the fundamental things are that are happening. And so, we talk about environmental effects or biodiversity. Well, that's not important to this other faction, or it's all a hoax. It's scientists creating this big hoax to get grant money. Yeah. I mean, I have a little file of documents of people publishing stuff like that. That the whole whatever pick your scientific issue. And it's all just a bunch of inbred academics, trying to get grant money. So we have different realities, and I think that's one of the fundamental problems. How do you attack the kinds of things we're interested in if the other 70% of the country doesn't even agree to the facts?
Disconnect.
There's total disconnects.
One of the, sort of leading into that, one of the things that I see, especially Gayle having done, is work really diligently and persistently on building institutions that would be long-lasting, like the Wilderness Act. Some would argue, if you lived in Little Ajo, there was backlash as a result of that. But institutions seem to be, because Ajo felt suddenly isolated, and there was,
But they're doing better.
They're doing much better now. But one of our questions is, how important is it to environmental causes to create these institutional structures, architecture almost that's for preservation, like the Wilderness Act that you were so...
Oh, it's absolutely vital. And I am so impressed with, for instance, both ISDA and SADO. I mean, Peggy and Rick took on what seemed like an insurmountable task. And although I know they get very depressed, and there are things happening such as what you saw here, and the big resorts in the Esteros near Puerto Penasco, which, as I guess Rick was saying, that they were able to have some improvements made. I mean, it could have been worse, but that's not exactly the outcome we would have liked. But still, I think they have been as effective as just about anybody I can imagine. We'll see if in the long term, it really works. One of the problems I thought Bill would bring up, because he usually does, is kind of the root problem of a lot of this is population.
Yeah.
Too many people, particularly on our side too. But I mean, that's why everybody's trying to come across the border. And Mexico is a beautiful country. It's got all kinds of natural resources, some wonderful qualities of life, but clearly it doesn't have the economic structure to maintain itself. I understand the birth rate there over the last 20 years has dropped from I think 5 to 3 or 6 to 3 or something like that. So it's kind of better. But, whether that can get under control, in the foreseeable future, I just don't know. I feel kind of pessimistic about that. And we're seeing, if you look at Mexico City, whatever is 20 million in this big smog stew, you're really seeing the spillover of all that up here in Sonora and Chihuahua, where we have all these wide open spaces, and we're not so used to mobs of people like that, but that's where these poor folks are coming from.
We've got to remember, in terms of legislative victories, which is what you asked about, or passing some act, these are all dynamical things. I mean, these are not done deals. And we see, I was just reading an editorial in the paper today, interviewing the Republican House leader about inaction, and he said very flatly that that's deliberately their policy, because they're just waiting till they get in power to undo, this. He had a list of things that have just been passed, which the other side is sort of cheering. Oh, we finally got this thing passed. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you can ever think of these things as, once they're passed, they're set in concrete, which means every generation is going to face some of these kinds of things.
I don't think that's quite true. We have some institutions in this country, both legislative ones, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act.
Institution is a good word, I think,
and
because that's a
land,
viable,
such as national parks, national monuments, Wilderness Act, that sort of thing. It's very unlikely that those will get undone. Whether they will be improved, I think it's something else again. And certainly that's true with the legislative kind of things, not so much the land mass. I don't think we have ever had a case in this country of a national park or national monument being de-accessioned, whatever the word would be. But certainly some of the legislation can become weaker. And we saw that in our state legislature here recently, which has been just really quite astonishing. One of the many little things that they did was a law was passed where the mining companies will sit on a committee to represent and regulate mines. And it had some other things to do with it. The whole purpose, it was put forward by Freeport-McMoran, and the whole purpose of it was to make it easier to mine, which it's pretty easy to do right now. So it was kind of strange, and there was lots of concern about it, and of course it sailed right through, and it got passed by Brewer. And it is true, just from a legislative point of view, it's always easier to pass things than it is to get rid of them for reasons that I'm not quite sure I understand, but that certainly is the case. But I think, looking to Mexico again, I have certainly seen wonderful changes there, and Bill alluded to this at the beginning. When we first started visiting the Pinacotes and so forth, it's too early for our mailman, we would see an occasional guy with his gun over his shoulder literally walk out of the dark into our little campfire and would sit down, and we'd sort of have to give him a cup of coffee or a beer or something, and we'd chat in Spanish or Spanglish or whatever, and he'd get up and walk away.
Or they'd help us get our car.
Or they'd help us get our car
being stuck in the sand.
Or whatever, something like this. But it would vary. But then, of course, and there was no management, no regulation, of course, at the Pinacotes at all. But there weren't very many people there, so in a way it didn't matter too much. But in the last, particularly 10 or 15 years, there's emerged this very well-educated kind of science middle class of Mexico. Archaeologists, biologists, geologists, etc., young people. So many of them go to the U of A, go back across the border, or continue to work there. And they're just superb. They don't, unfortunately, have a lot of institutional support. That's what really kills them. And some of them give up and come over here, marry an American and give up. But many of them don't. They slog on. We have Jupiter Martinez, an archaeologist you may or may not know, but wonderful guy. And a whole slew of them. And of course then the whole management of the Pinacotes itself, which started with those little shacks, little buildings, and 2 or 3 guys who were good-hearted but didn't have a lot of background. And then that has just improved enormously. And I have to give, I'm not even sure who gets the credit for that within the Mexican, national hierarchy. Somebody's concerned about these things. But unfortunately, not enough to really look, kind of analytically at the effects of overbuilding along the Sonoran coast. That seems to be, we're still looking at it from what Bill was calling the old economic model. We need jobs, we need this, we need that, so we're gonna make this the new Acapulco, or whatever it is.
Do you think that part of that may be this environmentalists who someone said, we interviewed not very long ago, in fact last night, that they take an absolutely no development, they're concerned with preservation, not other things, and that's part of...
It's Tuesday. That's who was rustling around on my front porch. I thought it was too early for them.
Oh,
sorry.
Sorry, no matter.
I thought you'd just keep
That's
going.
just fine.
Did you need to change your tape?
Just take 5 minutes.
Great moment.
Yeah, this is that. sorry to that.
Go ahead. Okay.
But just a thought picking up on future trends and institutions. I think one of the most positive things I've seen, it's very subliminal at this level, at this time, is what you might call the ISDA paradigm or the ISDA viewpoint.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
And that is what's always impressed me, and I tell it to other people when we come back from meetings, is the whole concept of three nations as equal partners in those discussions. And it's the Mexican side, the Autochthon nation, and the Americans. And if only we could export and spread that viewpoint a little bit more. I mean, that is so antithetical to what I was calling the broader framework that we have right now in the country. Most people just, I mean, that's way beyond and outside of the view that most people in Ohio or Indiana or somebody would have. And we're very used to it. I mean, we see things going back and forth. I think Pro Natura and what Carlos Nagel was doing was another great example of that. Gee, we have this community here. There happens to be a line across it, but it's a community. It's biologically critical too, because the pronghorn, the pronghorn population. I was looking at what we wrote in the 80s. Was it had gotten down to something like 500 and is back up to.
Well, it's not that high. You're probably mixing up bighorn sheep.
Maybe if well.
It was down to 20 on the American side, 26.
That was the bighorns. Right?
Pronghorns.
The pronghorns. Okay, yeah, okay. So it was down to 20 or 50 or something, and it's recovered.
But they had to work hard.
But the point is that you build a wall across that. There's a biological community that needs to interbreed, and we may not have enough individuals on either side of the wall, so that just putting the wall through could destroy the community.
Well, that's a geographical boundary. One of the other things I'm remembering where we were talking about boundaries between sustainable development and preservation.
Oh, you asked about the no preservation.
Right,
yeah. I think there is some truth to what you say. There are certainly some environmentalists, if we want to use that term, who really say, no people. And that's, I think, the model in this country, as I was saying before, of the national parks, the wilderness areas, which have nobody in them. I used to be more of that opinion. I'm much less so now. I think the model of trying to have people and the environment live together is much more feasible and positive, but it's very hard to do. And you see Peggy and Rick struggling with this, that they're trying to keep the fishing going and yet not deplete all the stocks, save the vaquita, etc. And unless you have very strong institutions in place, laws in place, and other ways for these people to make a living, it's just not going to work. I don't see any reason, in fact, why even in this country we couldn't try to preserve more land with very low density development of certain types, and maybe even keeping some of the land public, some of it private. But when you start trying to pursue these models, you just run into all kinds of legal problems. Because
of our framework.
Well, that, and also because of something that I think in this country we have more strongly than many places in the world, and it's the private property interest.
The model that Gayle's talking about is kind of the British and European model, where these little villages were incorporated into the parks. And there was, of course, wonderful material on the recent national parks PBS.
What's his name?
Yeah. the filmmaker.
The guy that does the documentary
Burns, Ken Burns.
Burns,
where he had numerous examples of the communities that just fought tooth and nail against declaring this national park, and then 5 years later they love it because they're getting.
Well, that was Udall used to say. The first they want to kill you, and the second, or there were 3 steps, and the third step was then they
preserve
then
land.
they put you up in a statue or something,
you, and then they like you, and finally they put up a monument to you.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know that. I mean, I still see.
But we certainly started out fighting it due to this paradigm.
And you see that in places like Utah, where it is fought much more strenuously, perhaps even than here, and it comes from some kind of an ethic of owning land, which I've never.
And land as a commodity.
And land as a commodity, which of course is absolutely antithetical to the Autochthon point of view, which I respect enormously, because I've always, in fact, for some reason internally, I have had problems seeing land as a commodity. I mean, not that you can't own your house and have it on a piece of land. Of course you can. But the notion that, big tracts of land can be owned and sold and have these things happen to them has never seemed to me to be the right way to go. And in the future, it doesn't seem like it has a long-term healthy prognosis.
Our framework has never been able to absorb the O'odham idea that the land sustains us, which is the state motto of Hawaii, I believe, from the native Hawaiian culture. That ultimately the land and the planet have to sustain us, and as long as we're just buying and selling it, that's ultimately going to be a problem. So we've got to change those big ideas.
But you can see too the other side is that the O'odham, or most Native Americans, grew up in places where their populations were small and the land mass was large, and so they came about, and they were very inextricably tied into the land. Now there are so many more people, and we live in a different way, that it's clearly much more difficult to make that model work.
7 minutes is my magic time span period, after which any of these issues you realize the ultimate problem and the ultimate solution deals with overpopulation. These things are all being caused by overpopulations that can't be sustained, I think.
Yeah, and this is kind of a pumping uphill thing, whether it's in the Sonoran Desert or globally. This is a hard struggle, and if it's a hard struggle globally, it's a particularly hard struggle here, where we've got boundaries and incredible amounts of growth and water shortages that for 30 years of knowing differently or systematically
But we may become the role model that finally shows people that you can run out of natural resources in this country.
That would be both terrible and
there might be something productive from that if a major city, starts to fail for lack of water.
I'd say one other little positive thing, almost more from a personal note, is one of the benefits I think I have from working in these areas is having friends who are O'odham now.
Okay.
It's been just so wonderful and so interesting, particularly people like Lorraine and Joe and others that I have met. I mean, they're very strongly still, even though Joe was in the Marine Corps and Lorraine went through ASU or whatever, she's a nurse, and they're very much in the Anglo world, but they still retain their perspective on the way people relate to the land, and it's very strongly felt. It isn't always practical, and there you can sort of make fun of it a little bit, and sometimes everything can't be sacred and these kinds of things. But still, I think it's a very worthwhile perspective, and I wish it's a sort of perspective that, as Bill says, that other 70% other people could have more of a handle on, and just those people themselves have been so enjoyable to work with. And I know they have tried so hard for the O'odham population on the Mexican side, which has been a very difficult matter. So they've been able to do some things, at least I know, actually put in a pump or whatever it was in Kiva, and some things that have helped those communities. Not as much perhaps as they would like, but that has been an interesting thing to watch as well.
I love the O'odham joke, which we have to get into the record, and maybe it's already in your record someplace, is that, as they say, that we don't cross the border crossed us.
Yeah, that was Joe. I used to say that, I think.
And that sums up something that the rest of the country needs to hear a little bit more.
Yeah.
Well, you certainly answered part of where I'm sort of going with this, which is what keeps you involved, and your love of the cross-cultural, different perspective. And I'm wondering if either in yourselves or other people, you can identify characteristics of people who have this kind of persistence and persistence to stick to this subject despite what seem to be inevitable disappointments and long range, not necessarily positive.
I'll be right back.
Thanks.
So I guess you want us both sitting during the answer, or should
go ahead. I think we can go ahead with you, Bill.
Actually, I'm gonna
Change.
The tape's about to end anyway,
Okay.
so let's just.
Okay. I was going to answer that by going to get my little sugar packet. This is in the kitchen, and I'm not sure where I got this, but I've had it for many years. And it says, success. If you have tried to do something and failed, you are vastly better off than if you had tried to do nothing and succeeded. And that's kind of my motto, that you have to stick your neck out sometimes, and it doesn't always work, but you just have to try. And I guess I am by nature, if not not as smart as he is. I am incredibly persistent, just because I hate to give up. I always feel like there just must be some way to resolve a problem, and also because it's easy to quit. You know, you can say, oh, okay, well, I didn't work, I'm done. But then what have you got? You know, you quit, so what? It just doesn't get you anywhere. And sometimes, you know, many times in some of these projects, like this miserable mine thing I got myself into by accident, you know, I would love to quit because it's not much fun. But I think, well, you know, I can't, because we just have to keep working on this. It would look bad, the other side would take advantage, you know, whatever it is, you know, you just have to keep pursuing things. And then sometimes, you know, when you're working on something like the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan or Wilderness, as Wendy said, you know, you see success around the corner or see something coming, and you see a reason to continue. I mean, we sat through 4 miserable years on the, let's see, what was it called? The Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan Steering Committee. And there were like 85 of us. And Chuck Huckleberry just said, oh, you know, anybody that wants to sit in on it can do it, basically. And it got down to be about 45 because half the people didn't show. And then of that group, we finally had to form a little 8-person rump group to get anything done. But 4 years was a very long time. And much of it was simply because of people who didn't want anything to happen, so they kept making it difficult. But finally, you know, we actually did succeed to some degree, not as much as I would have liked, but to some degree.
Talk to Tom Sheridan about this. He's very positive.
Yeah, he's worked more on the ranching, and of course he's now on the Open Space the Conservation Commission. And there has been a lot of success. As I said at the beginning, it's a big county, and so the success is not obvious, and there would be many people in Tucson that would have the faintest idea that any of this had happened. Yeah. You know, when you save land or when you preserve it, you don't see it. You only see it once it's gone. Then it's like, oh, I thought that land was in Tucson Mountain Park or something. Yeah. But if it just remains in its natural state, you know, there's no difference, and so you don't have...
People assume that there's some reason why it's being preserved or something, and don't realize it can go in a flash.
But at any rate, there are, you know, enough successes, I think, that help keep you motivated. And also the feeling that, well, there's just things that you have to work on because nobody else is. Well, not that nobody else is, many other people are. But, you know, there's problems that are sufficiently bad that you just feel like you have to keep trying to make some progress.
I think a characteristic of these people that are involved, that pretty much all the people that I think we know that we've talked about, that may not be realized often, is that they're kind of part-time in this. It kind of gets back to the point about the $400 an hour lawyers, because they're always there. The people who have an interest in intruding into the Sonoran Desert are always there. The rest of us are kind of like, I think, creative people in general in our culture. The really creative ones are working in garages and aren't getting paid $400 an hour, and are producing art and are producing the great American novel and so on. But they have to have their day job, and all of these kinds of people have a day job and try to come and go, kind of come in and go back out again in terms of some of these interests. Gayle had this wonderful statement, and I have to add, we both like ethnic diversity and what we learn from other cultures, and I've had a number of interactions with Russians, and I love the Russian sense of humor on a lot of big issues like this. And unfortunately, it's always dark, but it has a wonderful point and it has a dark twist. And so one of my most useful little jokes about this is the riddle of the difference. What is the difference between a realist and a dreamer? And my Russian friends explained to me that the realist thinks that maybe a flying saucer will come down and hover over the Capitol, and the aliens will get out and they will share all of their technology and their discoveries with us and help us solve all our problems. That's the realist, mind you. The dreamer thinks maybe we can get our act together and do it ourselves. and we'd have to be, we have to be kind of dreamers in this, because there's a lot of forces already that are going in other directions. Which is
you had said part-time, though, and I guess I want to clarify that a little bit, because it seems to me that those who are paid for economic reasons to be there at the table are not constant. There's tremendous amounts of turnover because they're in it, they're being paid to do it. It would feel to me that that's the part-time. And it's the person like yourselves who aren't paid but are sitting there time.
Individually,
they
they are part-time and they come and go, but that force is constant. And our force just dissipates, when we go home and manage the store and take care of business.
I think more of the point though is,
astronomy papers,
those people are, they make a lot of money, and so they can, afford to always be there, Whereas, and it isn't entirely true. I mean, Carolyn works, makes Carolyn Campbell does, the Boyers do. I have from time to time, but we never make nearly as much money as the other side does. So there is, is always kind of an inequality there, and there's usually a power inequality too. Although I think we've gotten a lot better at learning how to use power and maybe infiltrate the halls of power or whatever over the years. Not, we have a ways to go in that regard, but certainly better.
What if we not done?
We ramble
on
here.
Well, the one question that I guess I would wonder is, do you think individuals are more important than institutions or vice versa? Because we're interviewing key players, and the institutions are there. You've got the wilderness, but if you've got a bad manager at Cabeza Prieta, that institution may not mean as much. Or you've got the Pinacate, you've got just...
It's yin and yang.
It's kind of hard. It's really a combination. I think individuals create institutions.
You can't have the institutions without the individuals.
I think you start with those, and I think it's not.
But the institutions can be corrupted, as you said, or fail in their.
But they generally don't go away. At least the good institutions, they are stationed.
Which is
relatively
the point you were
stable.
making earlier, that it's good to accomplish getting something set up.
And certainly, I think in the Mexican economic system, where there need to be stronger institutions relating to environmental preservation and sustainability and all these kinds of issues. And the institutions are somewhat there, but they aren't enforced, I guess is what we generally hear.
That's a fascinating thing in Latin America in general, that you often see these big starts and all the trees are planted and everything, and big speeches are given, and then you come back 2 years later and the trees have died, or the beautiful big new piece of architecture now has a leaky roof.
Remember when that big arch went in at the Pinacates, before, at the very beginning, that big fancy thing, and it was one of those, you probably know this better than I do, Wendy, but speeches and so forth, and then it disappeared. But then actually later, the whole thing did get institutionalized, and it has, I've just
They're getting better about that.
Very impressed with that.
It was the problem of providing the ongoing sustainable funding for something,
rather
than just have a big start and then drop the
For a
funding.
while, we Americans were providing the gas for Fernando, for his Jeep, so
through Pro Natura.
Through Pro Natura,
and Carlos Nagel.
So he could at least do something out there. He was a very nice, hard-working guy.
Along this same line, it seems to me there's also the question of creative activity, such as we were talking about with the books and science. And so one of the questions I sort of have is, how important do you think these catalogs of species, this sort of documenting population dynamics and finding boundary lines, how important is that? And we talked to a lot of academics as
I think that's important for the long run. The very, very long run. I think our generation always has a responsibility, any generation, to leave a record of what was there, so that 100 years from now they can come back and look at that and see what the changes have been. So I think that's worthwhile. It's all kind of arcane and goes into some big book that maybe nobody looks at for 10 years, but at least the record is there.
I think it's useful too. I would agree. I would just say that I think you can't limit it to the list of species or whatever. For one thing, if you don't take some kind of action, the list will disappear, or the species will go away.
Something kind of related to that is something I thought of last night thinking about these questions, that there are kinds of, we could say, resources, I'm thinking of biological in particular, that do renew themselves one way or another, even if in what is a kind of an abhorrent case to most people in the community. If the buffalo grass comes in and replaces the Sonoran Desert, but that biology goes on. There's other kinds of resources like the archaeology, where we're in the last generation that's really going to ever see it the way it was left 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. I mean, there's materials anywhere in the country. This is just the nature of archaeology. There's a finite set of resources, really finite, literally finite, and they gradually dwindle away. And I was a little kid, and we went out to my grandparents' farm in Illinois, and we picked up arrowheads. They were all over the place,
right.
And those are all in cigar boxes in people's attics and things now.
It's interesting as you talk about it, how many physical objects turn out to be the focal point of human activities, whether it's books or species like the pronghorn,
The fence.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But both the Pinacates and Tinajas Altas, where I worked, are good examples of places where there has been so much human damage, human activity, that from a cultural point of view, the archaeological and more recent point of view, what was really exciting and interesting there is largely gone.
Yeah.
I mean, some of it's in books, and we have photographs, but if you go to Tinajas Altas today, you see some water tanks, and if you know where to look, there are some pictographs. But other than that, you don't see very much because, well, there's the mortar holes. You can't take those away. Although some of those, you may know, actually are in front of the Arizona Historical Society. They were taken away in the 50s, and another bunch of them are in somebody's backyard in Welton. Somebody actually, managed to dynamite them out of there. Or not dynamite, but remove them. So, even that is possible. But, so a lot of what I think of as Tinajas Altas, all the interesting things, that I know happened there, are just in my mind because I've worked on it and because I've read about it or I've written about it. But, the person that comes in there, a little dune buggy from Yuma, the snowbirds who love to go there now in the winter, to them it's just a fun little day trip, and you go and look at the water tank and you have your picnic and you drive home.
But that story itself of not only the history of the people who came through, but the change in the artifact inventory is part of the story of these places. And actually at the last ISDA meeting, there were some fascinating discussions of what to me is a kind of mind-warping, wonderful concept, that the shift of individual objects, like the old ranch houses out there was the case in point, from being detritus and clutter, that needed to be removed, to 10 years later being, this is part of the Cabeza Prieta we're trying to preserve. It's a change, kind of a change in paradigm in the Park Service. And at some level, it's always going to be 10 years or 50 years or 100 years earlier than you are, where the boundary is, but that boundary keeps moving forward. That what was a graffiti in 1920 is now suddenly an interesting piece of rock art on Tumamook Hill because it gives us a record of who was going up there at that time.
Well, and part of our interest here is how do those changes in the narrative and the conception happen? And that leads me to this business of communication and our odd finding that people who share these interests, unless they're engaged in a campaign like the Santa Ritas, they don't talk to each other all that much. How would you explain the fact that there are activists, and we've talked about them here, that you may not have talked to for a year or two, or in our case, sometimes 15 years?
Partly we're part-time people, and we're part-time activists.
We're only brought together, some of us are friends, and so we see each other all the time, but we are brought together by a particular action or need for action, and when that is going on, we sit at our table for 4 years with the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan, and then after that's over with, we largely do not. We have, our lives are somewhat different. We're not working for the same company, we're not at the same university necessarily, so we don't have constant, or we have the border situation with people on the other side who sort of disappear, like Maria Elena.
Right.
It's just much harder to keep in contact. Although just a little anecdote, what has been so helpful, and as I'm sure you all know, is email in terms of communicating with people in Mexico. The postal system didn't work. You never had telephones, or they didn't work. It was very, very difficult to communicate with somebody, even somebody you knew pretty well. You send a letter and you hope it got there a month later. now, my gosh, as long as they answer their emails, we can actually talk to people that were very hard to talk to
That's
before.
true all over the world.
Yeah.
We Skyped someone in La Paz yesterday.
Joaquin Murieta.
Oh, is that what's he doing
He's at
now?
EDF now, doing Upper Gulf.
Oh, he's not with the Sonoran Institute anymore?
No, he's been gone for 3 years.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I liked him. I like him. He's a nice guy.
Yeah, well, he's in a right smack in the middle. He's again one of those. You spoke about this earlier. A Mexican national who came up here and got educated and inculcated to the culture and a sensitivity, and then is now actually back down in Mexico in a position of power.
Oh, good.
It strikes me, just something popped into my mind, an image in terms of what holds these networks together, and especially if you're not seeing each other all the time, is the glue is really shared ideas, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that may be more true of that kind of community than some other communities where the glue is, even like our Planetary Science Institute, there's some stuff written on paper, there's a formalism, there's money flowing, the glue, the building is there, etc. This is a community of just sort of shared concepts and ideas.
But it's also
no building,
a visceral
constitution,
attraction or connection to the desert
and to the land,
and to the Gulf, to the land.
Ideas about the land, I guess, would be the way.
It's the land ethic notion, which, for better or worse, our ideas seem to differ a little bit from many other people's, and I think it's the fact that I like going out into the desert. I just enjoy doing it, even if it's for no particular scientific reason, just to take a walk. And so that keeps us doing things, I guess.
I wish we could get the idea out, the sort of nebulous paradigm out into the rest of the culture a little bit more about, partnerships and working across the border with people, and the ISDA model of the Aldom and the Mexicans and Americans all meeting. I mean, that seems to be so alien to what I see everywhere else and hear on the radio and all of that. And I don't know. I mean,
someone referred to it as two universes.
Yeah. I think it would be very hard for a lot of the people behind a lot of the discussion of the border and the wall and all of that to even understand that, we have friendships across the border and we're trying to do things in partnership and do things together. And I was talking to Guillermo Monroe the other day about us writing a novel together. We thought that would be a really neat idea.
Should be.
And yeah, he would be good. And I guess he's just, unfortunately, I'm kind of out of touch because he's just gone down to
apparently had some economic, of course he was working, very funny, after years of telling us what a horrible thing these condos were going to be, he ended up working for one of them because he spoke good English and he was making quite a good salary there.
And he had interesting stories about it too. I think he was collecting.
But then they kind of folded, and he apparently had to move to Hermosillo to make some money, I guess. He's had some health issues. He's had a stroke, and he seems to be okay, and he's harder of hearing now.
But he's still writing.
Yeah. We see him fairly regularly. He's a great guy.
Not for us to talk about, but you have to go talk to him. So.
Yeah, right.
Well, we'll see if we can get some contact things.
We have emails for him.
Good, that'll be great.
And he was the town cronista, which is another interesting concept.
Yeah.
In my mind, from Mexico and Sonora, each town having its cronista and
historian,
who sort of keeps the town stories and knows something about the history of the area. Right. We've had actual problems with like the city and county government trying to get who are the people to talk to, and when it comes to running a historical structure, for instance, like the Presidio, they're not really set up to deal with history. They're set up to run soccer fields and things like that. The Parks Department.
Yeah. I don't know if you know about the constructed Presidio downtown. It's a little outside of your interest, but
tell me.
Well, for many years, the archaeologists and historical community in Tucson has been very interested, and many other people too, particularly the Hispanic community that has lived here a long time, in the reconstruction of at least part of the original Spanish Presidio and the church, or convento it was called, across the river, the Mission San Agustin. And as part of the Rio Nuevo funding mechanism in 1999, These were some of the original reasons that was created. People kind of forgot that. And Rio Nuevo, which was, of course, a way of diverting some sales tax money that would go to the state and keep it here in Tucson to be used in the downtown area. Well, just by, again, some persistence and good luck and some other characteristics, we were able to reconstruct the corner of the Presidio downtown.
And having Gayle as president of the Presidio Trust during the crucial period.
There was a parking lot that was vacant, which was the good thing, so that there was a place. And archaeology groups had done some excellent excavation, Homer Teal and others, and actually found the corner of the Torreon, the tower, in the walls. So we've reconstructed this corner, and it's quite a tourist draw.
It's really been successful.
Although we need to do much, much better, because as Bill says, unfortunately, it's sort of, quote, managed by the Parks Department in the city, which one doesn't have the skill, and right now doesn't have the money to hire any staff that are worth anything. I mean, they're young folks that don't understand the issues.
But their staffing is not geared towards history. They don't have any little subsection of Parks and Recreation that deals with.
So the Tucson Presidio Trust that I belong to, and during the winter months, we do all kinds of living history down there on the weekends. It's kind of fun.
Foreign visitors particularly show up because they expect the centre-ville to have some culture and something interesting to look at.
Where is it, Gayle?
It's on the corner of Church and Washington Street.
You'd be interested to know, today in the paper, Fitzsimmons finished his 10-part walk around the city by walking to the Presidio and touching the wall. That was his last paragraph. And, this is where it all started.
It's been great fun, and it's we've run up against a lot of difficulties, but we did get built, and it's built well. And from October through the end of April, we're down there almost every weekend, it seems like. I've learned to spin cotton and wool. I've learned to weave. As a result of this, I decided I had to learn some skills if I was going to be down there doing this stuff and trying to interpret the past. And we have an outdoor beehive oven. We make bread and we cook turkeys and all kinds of stuff and feed the public. We have a group of soldiers who wear uniforms of the period. They're very knowledgeable. Reenactors. They went to a Park Service cannon school in St. Augustine, Florida, to learn how to properly shoot off this wonderful cannon that we have. They shoot bread. But it all has to be done carefully, of course. And it's very...
Mayor Walkup at the opening was charmed to remark that he was glad to see the cannon was aimed out into the county and not just into the city. So.
Anyway, it's been quite fun and quite successful.
Gayle and her succeeding president, the two of them together designed what you may also have encountered, which is the Presidio Trail, which is also called the Turquoise Trail, and that is that turquoise line on the sidewalks downtown, and it's modeled after the Boston Freedom Trail. There was a fascinating collision of cultures, though. I mean, to me, a really great example of really colliding paradigms, because when they started, we all just assumed that what you want to do is try to reconstruct as nearly as possible from the original. We knew where the foundations were and everything, the appearance of that Presidio, so school kids could come down and see what it was like, what did the Spanish build, what would that have been like to live in. Suddenly collided with the community of architects in town, and they were particularly in the sort of architectural theory du jour, which was that you never build something to look like a past object, because that's fake. And they kept throwing around the word fake, and so it should have some steel and glass, and be a modern thing designed by an architect.
But we bought them off.
But that really came down to like a vote on a committee.
Yeah, it was Brooks Jeffries, who's a good friend of mine. But it was. They just
had a completely different view of the world, and I don't know why it never spoke to them about kids being able to come down, because that's what I remember. And like I said, Western Pennsylvania.
The fact that virtually every mission in California has been rebuilt from nothing to look like the original missions. Those missions were all gone. Some of them had even been moved. But I don't think people want to come see something that just
You don't want
is
to. I mean, in
reminiscent.
their mind, it's kind of the Disneyland model.
I know,
and
we
that's-
worked hard to
was
not
never
do
what
that.
we, you know, what the Presidio Trust was.
But anyway, yeah, it has been interesting, and it was, you know, more or less successful. We need more staffing. We need to do better in the future. But it's there, and it's being visited. And then this Presidio Trail that Margie Cunningham and I created. It's not a historic trail. It's just it was Margie's idea, and I kind of helped implement it. Where we, as Bill says, we got the city to let us they put the blue line on the sidewalk downtown. It's about a 2.5 mile loop.
And that
we
little
have
map has little places
so
that you stop.
You pick up the map, and you can follow the line, and if you open it up, you can see the map, and it tells you something about each place. So we wrote all that.
Downtown.
That has been incredibly successful. We have now given, I think we're up to 80,000 of these things in the last 3 or 4 years, maps.
And initially, the downtown tourist groups were not interested in this at all.
No.
And now they keep asking for new reprints.
Well, yeah, the Visitors Bureau is more interested in conventions and golf.
For the Chamber of Commerce, again.
When Margie and I went down the first time, he said, why would anybody want to do this? But we mostly get the money from private businesses downtown who support it, and a little bit from the city and the county. It's not very
I
expensive.
can imagine ISTA doing something like that.
Yes.
They're doing this project with
That's a great
Mexican
idea.
Town and Indian Town,
Yes.
and they've got so many places there.
Yeah.
The mine, the
Yeah.
Overlook.
Yeah.
So propose that to them.
Okay,
They won't be
the
here.
thing is that the trick that really made this work was the street. It's not just a map. There's other maps that
Yeah.
exist, but the line on the street.
Yeah.
Because people, don't read maps very well,
Yeah.
we've discovered. And this really is an attraction. You can just follow that line, and it seems to be, much, much more interesting than simply holding.
As Tracy seems to be building, the art and the culture
Yeah.
and the environment, it would be
This
an
physical
amazing
thing
thing
would be-
because
Yeah.
you were saying, well, what do I do if we come here? You've got to
Yeah,
have
that's right.
Go to
things.
Curly
Yeah.
School and the old mission and tell the story. Every
Well,
time
and then
these things.
Cabeza, I can imagine these
Yeah,
are sort
artist
of put it
studios
together
and-
as the package. Yeah.
Yeah, in that case, it might have to be more of a driving
Drive,
map
yeah.
than a walking one.
That would be
but-
fine too.
But that would be fine too, yeah. You could still make it quite interesting, yeah. Okay.
Okay,
We're
this
done.
was really great. This was very helpful.